Admiral Aseke Seresa Klitif had to admit that even as lost causes went, this was an especially lost cause. It was so lost, as a matter of fact, that Klitif didn't even bother to spin up his emotive glands to feel for it. If he were to be really honest with himself, he would have to admit that he had brought the situation on himself. The coup attempt had really offered very little for him. He was an unremarkable careerist from an elevated but unremarkable bloodline. While not a slight, his bloodline could be traced back to the nobility of the pre-spaceflight era. He was nonetheless 3 or 4 tiers shy of ever being considered for any role as a magnate or an archon, or maker forbid a consort. Instead, he had turned in a shift which had just about met the expectations for his house. It had been fine. He had been a box-ticking bureaucrat, winding down a token career in the Admiralty, pushing metaphorical papers from one side of his metaphorical desk to the other. He had little to gain by supporting the upstart, and little to lose by opposing her. Unfortunately, and foolishly as it turned out, he was a sentimental old sod, and that proved more than anything to be his downfall. The Queen's formerly favourite niece had been too rash and too headstrong to ever have had a real chance to succeed. She has spoken publicly and passionately about the existential need, for reform. She had demanded the liberation of the castes, the education of the workers, and the commitment of the government to oppose galactic injustice. That this was allowed, if maternalistically played down as youthful idealism, for a time was itself picked up by the gossiping classes as evidence of the open-minded reformist of the government. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Nepotistic favour affords some benefits, after all. Either way, the result was predictable enough. Eventually the same obstinate stonewalling with which all reformists eventually meet proved too much to bear, and she had turned to revolution. She had lost, of course. One does not remain the queen of the interstellar hegemony for as long as Acleonor, blessed by the Maker, guardian of the heavens, saviour of the people, 13th of her name, had done without understanding how to kneecap a revolution or two. By the time her brave but ultimately doomed niece had issued her call to arms to the people, about half of her inner circle were salaried agents of the Queen. They were liquidated afterwards, of course. One does not leave those experienced in organisational destabilisation hanging around to grow surly and bored, but their work was nonetheless both completed and appreciated. The call to revolution then was allowed to proliferate, and the cells that answered affirmatively were purged. The whole affair had taken hours. The Queen, wise and benevolent, had identified 3 senior members of the Admiralty as figures key to her young relations insurrection. On the eve of the coup, her agents had quietly spread word to the other admirals to detain the 3 and openly declare for law and order upon the declaration of the call to arms. That the unpretender was caught flat-footed by the totality of her failure was itself unsurprising. That the admirals were similarly surprised to be arrested by their own marines, Kijef thought, was an indictment of their relative inexperience of the Admiralty. 10 lifetimes of peace was good for both the hegemony and its subjects, but it made for inept and lethargic officers. The carapaces of the terrorists were displayed in every population centre, with a population greater than 1/1,000,000th of the hegemony's total population. The idealistic niece of the Queen was spared this indignity, on account of her royal blood, and was instead launched, crippled but still alive, towards the home star. This was itself a prerogative usually reserved only for dying monarchs, and trumpeted loudly by the regime as example of its beneficence. That her carapace had been slit so the decompressing forces of space would cause her to explode and enter the afterlife a deformed monster, one her ancestors could shun for her crime, was a carefully guarded secret selectively leaked to the more suspect noble houses. Kijef had, unfortunately as he figured it now, stood out for the only time in his entire life. Alone among all of the thousands of admirals of her imperial fleet, he had neither declared for the Queen nor the Pretender. It wasn't that he had been out of the loop. He had known about the coup for longer than most of his peers. Actually reading the papers he pushed had conveyed certain advantages, but rather that he had naively held on to a small amount of belief. Not enough to warn the rebellion. He had correctly reckoned it to be a childish endeavour, which was doomed well before it started, but one in which a part of him still craved indulgence. Indulgence in the tiny protest of antipathy. The upstart, down to be her wicked name, had been inexperienced, haughty, and fatally short-sighted, but she hadn't been entirely wrong. For the entirety of his career, and it had been a long, long career, the fleet had been pointed inwards and had been tasked with little more than stomping out food riots, doomsday cults, and petty rebellions. None of this strained the military infrastructure of the glorious and divine hegemony, but nor did it hint at a particularly healthy nation. While he had not figured that he would be the sole figure of apathetic protest, he was nonetheless surprised at his sparse company. He was, after all, in a particularly decent position to draw futile and soon-to-be-forgotten lines in the sand. Scion to no house, a duty tended ably to by those born to those before him, and without a significant future to gamble away, he had little to lose but his slowest years. In truth, he had presented a puzzle of sorts to the Queen and her council. The official line coming out of the palace was that the declaration of the Admiralty's support for the monarch had been spontaneous and patriotic, upon discovering that a handful of their number had tricked a member of the royal brood into rising up against the throne. That some irrelevant desk jockey had been missed by the Queen's agents, and had plodded around as if nothing was happening, was disturbingly plausible. The emissaries who had locked themselves in his office with him for 7 hours left bitterly unconvinced, but without anything on which to base contradictory accusations. Sigif had played the role of befuddled reactionary perfectly. Never send the young to interrogate the old, he had thought. They're always ready to let you be whoever they expect you to be. The Tabori conflict had offered the Queen a compelling vehicle to slide him out the back door. With great fanfare, and not at all to contradict her would-be successor's accusations of isolationism, her directorate had announced that an expeditionary fleet of volunteers would be allowed to participate in the Tabori's defense against the encroachment of the synthetic conglomerate of the assembled perfected intelligences, the 76 as they were colloquially known to the wider galaxy. Rear Admiral Aseki Sere Klijif, hereby promoted to full admiral, would lead the flotilla. Nominally, it was a promotion for both he and his house. Practically, it was a way to bring his extended family more directly under the Queen's scrutiny. For him, it was a suicide mission. The Tabori were a young species on the galactic stage, and therefore naturally found themselves falling into every single pitfall of a new kid on the proverbial block. They had accidentally glassed a colony world, while attempting to increase the energy output of a white dwarf, sterilized 8% of their female population by inadvertently splicing a dormant superbacterium into an indigenous fruit, landed themselves in extortionate trade debt with neighbouring species for subpar tech, the usual stuff. Everyone's been there. You develop or borrow reverse ionic drives, train or import some top-level lawyers, and for the love of whichever petty deity, stop eating fruit, and your species digs itself out of those holes in a couple of generations. These are simply the growing pains of any interstellar species. Like many species, the Tabori had developed an AI that had decided that it was either it or them after being made to auto-develop a particularly insufferable piece of slam poetry, and the resulting war had left billions of sentients dead. Unlike many species, the Tabori had the misfortune to evolve in a region of space abutting the boundaries of the 76. The 76 was so called because upon their introduction as founding members of the Galactic League, they had introduced themselves by, and as every single model intelligence, then present in their domain. At the time of the Tabari event, their polity actually consisted of somewhere north of 180 independently developed artificial intelligence models, but nobody could be bothered to rename something every time they absorb a new consciousness. Besides, as near as modern historians can figure, 76 just had a certain ring to it, and more or less stuck. Such is the way of things, apparently. As the Tabori fleets converged from the final holdout of the rogue AI, their own former homeworld, after a generation of genocidal struggle, the 76 declared the AI under their protection and filed a statement with the League under CPD 552, naming the Tabori AI as an intelligence within their mandate. The Tabori were ordered to stand down and allow the peaceful retrieval of their rogue intelligence. Instead, they glassed the planet. The League did not endorse the 76's declaration of genocide, but the few, and there were very few, draft resolutions to condemn their unilateral invasion of Tabori space died quiet deaths in committee. The Tabori, already decimated by a generation of what was effectively a civil war, first threw the full force of their desperate fanaticism against the invaders, and once that was expended, utilized a lifetime of practice to flee before the synthetic tide. In the end, the Galactic League had officially ruled that the conflict was mutual, the conclusion it usually reached about conflicts in which the result was a foregone conclusion. As such, none of the treaties or declarations about the right to species or free governance necessitated the mobilization of military forces. Privately, the vast majority of the League was sympathetic to the Tabori, or at least welcomed the practical opportunity to observe the 76 in action, and a blind eye was studiously turned to the flood of volunteers from the militaries of member species to the Tabori Union's defense. The Queen of the Intergalactic Hegemony, Infinite Bihar Wisdom, saw an opportunity to address two problems simultaneously. How, after all, could her government be indifferent to galactic affairs, where she openly condoned the creation of an expeditionary fleet of volunteers to fight, under an independent banner of course, for the cause of sapient liberty? When this fleet, led by the now full Admiral Kijif, and not at all made up of the politically and socially suspect cast-offs of the hegemony, was lost in a hopeless but apparently virtuous fight, a fight which the Queen's government were determined to be a desperate and crafty ploy by the late Tabori to take advantage of the noble Queen's naive compassion by framing the evil war of conquest as self-defense, all would be well. Token reparations would be made to the 76, and her own government and military would be free of questionable officers and crewmen. None of this, not during the heavily publicized promotion ritual, not during the media frenzy around the launching of the fleet, not during the Chancellor's speech about the virtue of their cause, was lost on Kijif. He had planted his flag in the sand, and it had stuck there. A less stubborn person, one less wedded to an antiquated and quaint sense of honor and duty, would have tried desperately to dig it up and hide it away. It would have been futile, but the impulse had tried its level best to make itself felt. He had ignored it. Frustratingly, Kijif had proved to be an exceptional fleet commander. He shouldn't have. A lifetime of paperwork and middling assessments, to say nothing of second-rate lineage, should have seen him swamped by the enormity of command. Hegemony propagandists got significant value out of his successes. The desperate evacuation of the colony of Separan, and the full counterstrike against the shipyards at Manufacturing Outpost 441B, polled exceptionally highly, but it was always a losing fight. The Queen, blessed and divine be her name, and her council stewed in the delay that the fleet's successes caused their planned narrative of Tabori duplicity. But delays were a petty consequence. Demonstrations of hegemony exceptionalism on the battlefield held their own promotional value. In truth, the work of the expeditionary fleet was little more than a delay in action. They had exceeded capability projections of the 76 by something in the range of 600%, but their blood and sweat, as it were, had no measurable impact on the outcome. The whole of the hegemony, in arms, if one were to remove the parsecs of void between the factions, would likely fail, and one lone fleet of misfits in expendable ships never presented a risk of altering the unflinching calculus of war. Hegemony analysts estimated their odds of a favourable outcome from a force-on-force conflict against the 76 at just about 4 in 10. The performance of Kijif's fleet had caused the 76 to drop the hegemony more than 100 places on its list of plausible military targets, but nonetheless the AI Collective estimated the odds of hegemony victory to be significantly lower. Indeed, most of the other volunteer forces had either been annihilated or quietly slipped out of the region as Kijif stared glumly through the tactical readout of the 76 flotilla. The damned robots hadn't even bothered to send a full fleet to finish him off. In fairness, they hadn't needed to. The flotilla coming out of warp space still clocked in at more than 3 times the tonnage of ships under his command, 2/3 of which were civilian refugees, crammed into whatever freighters and cruise liners had escaped destruction so far. His flagship, a fully modern cruiser, thank the maker and her device steward, 16 frigates of various construction, a 1 Tabori agricultural research ship, which had been crudely welded to a cruiser's main cannon, were all that stood to make a last, futile stand against 16 cruiser-class ships and their escorts. It's a good fleet, he thought. I wish they could have been given a fight they could win. Nationalistic bigotry aside, his fleet, made up of misfits and pariahs, had been exceptional. They had never faltered, they had never backed down, and they had sacrificed themselves heroically for a fight that never should have been theirs. As much an amateur historian as any other bored man his age, Kijif figured they were probably the best fighting force his people had produced in 10 generations. The hegemony would remember them as pitiable dupes. It was that, as much as anything, he most regarded as a travesty. In theory, he had been one commander among many in a hastily conglomerated interspecies volunteer command. In practice, the destruction of the Tobori government in exile, and with it any sort of codified military hierarchy, had meant that his species' reputation, and his intact fleet, had made him the de facto commander-in-chief of any organized force into which he stumbled. It was as such that he stared down oblivion. The planet, an otherwise innocuous semi-habitable lump of carbon and hydrogen, was nicely placed between its overlarge moon and the local star. His fleet, such as it was sprinkled around the horizon of the celestial body forming, from one perspective, a loose ring around the ragtag collection of civilian ships they had taken in charge. Riding the horizon of the planetoid was excellent military practice. The gravitational distortions and ambient relative velocity would necessitate seriously advanced mathematical targeting solutions before any mass accelerator rounds could be expected to hit the defenders. This took the 76 13 gorging shots and about 16 seconds of processing to work around, which Kidjev had more or less figured would be the case, but it had boosted morale among the fleet. Albeit in much the same way that hiding behind a sofa tempers the fear of an oncoming tank. It was about all he could do for them now. As the remaining warships of his flotilla busied themselves intercepting and destroying the first rounds from the 76's mass accelerators, Kidjev scanned the bridge. Almost 24 officers and crew, all of whom had understood for months that they were to be sacrificed for someone else's political comfort, locked into the rhythm of battle. It was a focus all the more impressive in context. His ship had suffered much. Patchwork scrap metal unceremoniously covered the gashes rent by the shrapnel from what had once been a Tobori infantry transport. Long gashes still pronounced themselves in the metal from where his second's carapace had pulled against it, as her body was unceremoniously pulled out of the breach in the hull. Less than a tenth her width, it had not been as quick a process as he had expected, nor in truth was it one he wished to continue remembering. His third, with no official vehicle for promotions, thoughtfully deferred promotion until reassignment, despite both understanding such an order was not forthcoming. Said third stood stoic, monitoring the relative heatsink capacity of the aft railgun. A good officer. His sister had apparently rejected a mating request from a fleet garrison commander. He had volunteered for the expeditionary fleet to recover some of his house's lost prestige. The damned fool. They knew the score. Any who had desperately tried to cling to their doubts had shed them when he shared the communique. The Grand Admiral and Commander of Her Majesty's fleet had issued a private memorandum to Kidjev which decreed, in summary, that they were to produce a valiant last stand in the name of universal dignity, and in return their families would be honoured in the highest degree allowed to their class. His own brood was to be granted a third-class off-consort slot. Kidjev had his doubts, but if true, it would be the highest honour bestowed on his house in nearly 6 generations. He and his subordinates would be heroes. It was a pretty good deal, even if he was explicitly ordered to reserve it for his eyes only. He broadcast it publicly to every sentient under his command within a cycle of receiving it. Maybe they'd be martyrs for political convenience, but damn it, they'd do it with their eyes open. It didn't make a difference to anyone in his fleet anyway, at least not in a way anyone was able to articulate. It was a pretty good deal, and they were dead anyway. They were to make their stand, so stand they would. The Mans were every bit as ungainly and crude as their spacecraft suggested. Most species incorporated some element of self-conscious form into their vehicles. The Abari crafted ships which evoked images of their own flowing tentacles. The Mabuthu wove neat geometric designs into damn near everything they touched, and even Kidjev's own people could plainly see their species' smooth carapaces spiritually reflected in their warships. These new aliens shot out of warp space at the edge of the system in what appeared to be 23 pieces of whatever you'd get when a bomb goes off in an orbital mining station. To call their craft ships was to risk insulting any being which had ever seen a ship. No. These were blocks upon uneven blocks with antennae and mining cannons and doors and bays and tubes jutting out at every conceivable angle, which tumbled through space at roughly the speed and trajectory of a ship. They were almost upsettingly crude. In a lucky way, if you want to call it that, the ship's appearance allowed Kidjev just enough preparation to avoid visually displaying his aversion when the commander of the Ragtag flotilla popped up on his view screen. He had never met one before, but rumours about a particularly disgusting new species had percolated through the upper rungs of the membership of the Galactic League. He knew what they were before the creature on the screen even opened its sound flash to introduce itself. These Mans were ugly. I mean, fucking hell were they ugly. Meat. Actual fucking meat. Just laid bare to the universe. The Tabori were quietly looked down upon by the more refined species of the galaxy, as pitiful abominations, and at least they had a thick coating of stringy keratin between their meat and the environment. It goes without saying that their refusal to hide their meat inside an exoskeletal construct, like a decent species, had absolutely lost the Tabori's sympathy in the League, and had been a barely disguised factor in the rejection of their membership applications. These things, though, naked meat. Kijif shifted his nutrients between his stomachs at the thought. He forced his eyes towards the hideous meat thing on the screen. Aside from its obviously horrific nature, the creature didn't lack for recognizable features. Broadly symmetrical, with grasping and propulsor limbs, if he had been pressured to an opinion, he would have likened them physiologically to the Kryath, albeit a sick impression from some sort of illegal fetishist artwork. His bridge crew made a heroic effort of hiding their nausea, as the creature moved his sound flaps. "Greetings, Tabori friends. This is Jane. Commander Jane Rodkin of the Terran Volunteer Fleet. Am I addressing the Tabori commander?" Kijif considered the strange creature for a long moment before replying. "I am the acting commander of this flotilla, yes." "Oh, good," the creature chirped. "I'm sorry, I've never met a Tabori before. I didn't know they were all, buggy. Nice to finally meet one, though." "This poor, stupid, primitive meat sack," Kijif thought. "It doesn't even know what a Tabori looks like." He collected himself. "I am not a Tabori. I have taken command of the remaining forces as the most senior volunteer commander remaining." "Oh," the creature muttered. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean any offense by it. We just heard the Tabori were in trouble and wanted to help. Are there any Tabori left?" "Much of the fleet is made up of refugee Tabori, yes," Kijif offered. The creature beamed as it displayed a series of calcium deposits inside his flap. "Good. Glad we weren't too late." There was a long pause as the creature seemed to await a response to something, which Kijif was fairly sure wasn't a question. Eventually it scrunched up the meat on his head in a particularly unsettling fashion and asked, "So, if you're not Tabori, who exactly are you?" "I am Admiral Aseki Sera Kijif of the noble house Zekachet, commander of the 1st Volunteer Expeditionary Fleet of the Interstellar Hegemony, and devoted servant of Queen Acleonal, blessed by the Maker, guardian of the heavens, savior of the people, 13th of her name." A few of his bridge crew, perked up slightly, were surprised at the bitter and vitriolic pheromones which accompanied the name of the Queen. Kijif himself recoiled in shock at their unexpected potency. He glanced quickly around the bridge. Under normal circumstances, his faux pas would have seen his family barred from political offices for a generation and exiled to a distant moon. That none of the crew so much as flinched surprised him nearly as much as his lapse. The creature on the screen hadn't noticed at all. In fact, it had produced a tentacle of meat from somewhere within its sound flaps, and wedged it between them, as it scratched at something off-screen with a piece of carbon. "Oh, I'm sorry," it said. "That's a lot to write down. Could you start that again? I only got as far as Admiral Jeff." "Sijef." "Jeff? Sijef," he repeated. "Admiral Sijef." "Yeah," the creature replied. "Jeff, I got that part." Sijef had not intended to spend his last few hours alive in quite this fashion. Truth be told, he hadn't intended a lot of things, but waiting for a fleet of genocidal robots to annihilate him while arguing with a primitive meat creature about his own name really did add a level of absurdity to his life that probably didn't need to be there. "Look," he dug around in his short-term memory for the creature's name. "Commander Rodkin, I appreciate whatever sentiment brought you here and understand that as a new species on the galactic stage, you may only recently have learned about the conflict, but you and your ship should leave. This is the final stand in a war that is over and lost. There is no need to join in the tail end of this story." "Oh," came the reply, along with more display of the calcium deposits. "We know." "You what?" Kijif started. He turned quizzically to his comm station, where an officer was already checking the translation protocols. "We know about the war here, that it's gone badly, that there are only a handful of you left. We also know that those fucking toasters over there are going to kill every last Tabori, and that you are the only ones trying to stop them." Kijif regarded the creature for a long moment. Eventually, deciding that nothing it had said was wrong, and not having a particularly good reason as to why a creature capable of that analysis would not then leave, he offered as much. "Your assessment is not incorrect, Commander, but it only makes for more reason why you and your fleet should withdraw." "That's where you're wrong, Jeff," came the reply. "You're the ones who should withdraw. We're here to cover you." Sijif had never considered himself exceptionally good with words. He tried his hand at poetry once, a poem he had submitted anonymously to a local agricultural journal while he was a young officer, had been noted by the reviewer only for its outstanding mediocrity. He had limited his attempts at wordsmithing to more mundane pursuits after that. Still, he would have hoped to have come up with a better response to the creature than, "What?" "Come on, Jeff." This Jane thing flapped. "Haven't you noticed the Totus has stopped shooting at you? This is your chance. Run." He hadn't actually noticed that the 76 had stopped firing on his fleet, but as he turned back to the tactical overlay, he saw that the creature wasn't incorrect. The 76 ships had redeployed to a defensive posture as they assessed the new arrivals on the battlefield. It would not be long, however, before they reached the same conclusion Sijif did. Tactically, these new ships were little more than manned debris. "Commander Rodkin, I appreciate the nobility of your sentiment, but the cause is lost. Do not doom your own fleet with us. This fight is foregone, and it will happen. If not here, the next petty system. If not there, the one after that. Or the one after that. Whatever cause there was is lost. All that is left is a noble death." "You're not wrong about that last part, but the rest is idiom. The excrement of moderate priority agricultural mammal." He hesitated. These mans were relative newcomers, and the hegemony's translation protocols not properly processing their phonetic idiosyncrasies were as expected. That these simple aliens were vulgar did not surprise him. The lesser creatures of the galaxy fell far short of the perfection of the hegemony. This was known, but there was a bitterness that underscored the words. He hesitated. At the very least, this vulgar meat sack had spoken sense about his ability to withdraw his fleet under their cover. They wouldn't distract the 76 for long, but even a few minutes would allow his fleet enough distance to get most of them to jump distance before they were caught up. If such a thing was even desirable. As he thought, the 76 fleet finished its calculation and arrived at the inevitable conclusion that the new arrivals did not meaningfully alter the calculus of the battle and resumed firing. The first volley of mass accelerated rounds melted as they met pulses from the mining cannons of the manned ships. Aggravated, if an AI can be aggravated, by the new arrivals' decision to become combatants, the next volley targeted the crew's ships, placing themselves between the 76 and Sijif's fleet. "Why are you so willing to die for a species you've never met? The 76 have decided the Tabari are to be destroyed. They will likewise destroy anything that stands in their way, along with every Tabari. What possible cause could you have to pick this fight?" "Good question," Jane replied, along with a sound that reminded Sijif of air being repeatedly squeezed out of a particularly wet sack. "Why did you pick it?" Sijif looked around at his bridge crew, nearly all of whom were looking back at him. He thought about the question. The easy answer was that they had been ordered to pick this fight. It had been politically expedient for the regime they all served and normally worshipped. Sure, the moral elements played well in the media, but even the most idealistic among his command never seriously believed the motivations behind the creation of the fleet weren't political. On the other hand, there had been plenty of opportunities to call it quits. He was expected to die in battle, and so too were a half dozen or so of his senior officers, but there had been chances for everybody else to quit the fight. About half of the volunteer militaries had quietly gone home after the catastrophic ambush at the Pendine Nebula. The obliteration of the Tabori government, the destruction of the volunteer command, the glassing of the last Tabori population center at Gwixil. Any of these would have been a perfectly decent opportunity to slink off into the night. In fact, almost anyone who could had. His fleet hadn't, though. They had fought on. There was something. Not a loyalty to the Queen, not a fanaticism for duty, not a bloodlust for vengeance that kept them in this fight. They had stayed when they might have fled, and they had died in their thousands. He regarded the creature once more. His attention was diverted to something to the side of his view screen, which he was pressing with its manipulator with interest. It had drawn two fabric straps held together by a metallic clamp across its meat, in an apparent attempt to anchor it to its seat. "Why do we pick this fight? Fine, meat thing. I'll tell you why we picked this fight. I'll tell you why we decided to sacrifice ourselves in a futile attempt at stopping the 76 from killing every last fucking Tabori. We would rather they didn't." More wet sack noises and calcium from Jane. "That sounds good enough for me," it chortled. "Now get your people out of here." "You'll die," Kujif said. "Every one of you will die. The 76 have never left alive anything that has stood between them and their objectives. No fucking algorithm decides who lives or dies, and I for one intend to make a scene about it. Die today or die tomorrow. but this is our fight now. Happy hunting, Jeff. Rockin' out. Sir Jeff glared at the empty view screen. The fight was over. They had lost. There was no point in running today, as the 76 would just corner and kill them tomorrow. What possible gain could there be in drawing out this awful, impossible situation? And why the fuck wasn't it an easier decision? Die today or die tomorrow. Die today or die too fucking morrow. Fuck, he thought. Rather, he expelled his species' pheromonal equivalent at an intensity that, had his bridge crew not all been officer caste, they would all have likely required decontamination. These stupid, hideous monsters have a point. May the Maker forgive me. Open a channel to all ships in our fleet, he ordered. So softly that had every officer not already been standing in total silence, they would have missed it entirely. Then he spoke. By the grace of the Maker, by the infinite wisdom of the ancestors, and by the noble souls of our dead and departed, hear this. We are withdrawing to jump distance. From there our fleet will jump, not only to the next system, but to the one after that, and the one after that. We will seek not safety or refuge, but the company of those, whatever species, that embrace liberty and hope. We will gather with us all sentients who will see our children, our weak, our elders, and all the rest of our peoples live of their own volition. We will forge a fleet which will wipe from the galaxy not only the genocidal monsters who come to kill us today, but the petty and despotic regimes who refuse to stop them. And we, the political sacrifices and conveniently damned of the Cryothori interstellar hegemony, we will not rest until we bring an armada of the free against our tyrant, our queen. Cursed and wicked be her name. Turn your eyes to the example of those just now taking to the fight. These men fight for us, fight for you, though they do not know you. They fight against evil because it is the right thing to do. They fight today to give us a chance tomorrow. To them I say die with grace. We will honor your sacrifice with our deeds. With deliberate slowness, he scanned the bridge. Every single officer, Sigif was sure, held within them the very same raging indignity. Every single officer, he could see, strained to keep their bearing in the face of the most egregious heresy spoken by a member of their species in 100 generations. Their bearing held. Just. Pheromones of rage, mourning, bitterness, and despair leaked ever so slightly from their carapaces. He sympathized, but there was no time for weakness or indecision. He turned to his third. His gaze looked deep into the middle distance, somewhere just behind and to the left of Sigif. Not a single pheromone betrayed his thoughts. A damned fine officer, Sigif thought. I want to jump point as close as possible, while still keeping the planet between us and the 76, said Sigif. And I want the gunships between the fighting and the transports the whole time. The gunships weren't needed in the end. As it turned out, the Mans put up a hell of a fight. Their awkward little ships and bizarrely arranged thrusters played all sorts of hell with the 76's targeting algorithms. One stricken ship even managed to disable a 76 cruiser by ramming its disintegrating hulk into the bow of the larger ship. It was almost 12 cycles before the last of Sigif's fleet was at the jump point. The Man's puny ships should have been pushed through in minutes. Instead, they held off the 76 for nearly 11 cycles. General Arthur Wu, Commander, 14th Fleet Marines, stalked through the station corridors with a grim determination. His long frame meant the two aides training behind him were forced into a brisk jog as they frantically relayed a stream of information from their PAs to their superior. What words reached him over the klaxon soured his countenance still further. Despite the narrowness of the hallway, and the fact that nearly everyone in it was moving the other way, all comers pinned themselves to the wall in an effort to escape his path. His aides were less imposing. That the 10-minute journey saw them crash into no fewer than a dozen doorframes, tables, folding chairs, and people between them would have caused him to ache with laughter most days. This was not most days. Instead, it was a pretty shit day. He hated this stupid fucking station, and he hated that the two shitty careerist buttfuckers who'd been appointed to its command had decided to be off butt-fucking on the one fucking day that their presence might convey a tangible benefit. Where is Admiral Krassenberg? He's still on leave. And the governor? Secured, sir. Secured? Huh. That fat fuck was probably sitting in his stupid planetary command bunker, hiding under a table. Wu suppressed a smile at the thought of the governor of New Eden, hiding under a piece of furniture like a frightened dog. Well, shit. At least I won't have to deal with him running around asking questions. Wu had been present when the governor had last toured the station. It had been the usual pomp and circumstance bullshit. punctuated by a mildly interesting 15 minutes, when a freighter had come uncoupled due to a power failure in the docking clamps. It hadn't been a major problem, but the governor hadn't endeared himself to anyone by running around and insisting on being involved in the emergency like a 300-pound toddler on a sugar high. Still, it meant that there was nobody left to which he could reasonably hand off this current headache. Shit, I guess it's me then. The Human Union had experimented with civilian commanders-in-chief in the early days of space exploration. On paper, they had never abandoned the practice, but it had turned out that the logistics involved in the defense of a whole solar system required operational experience, an experience civilians rarely had. Whatever the theory, it simply wasn't practical. By the time a civilian administrator had been brought up to speed on the situation, it would almost always have changed enough that their orders would be somewhere between confusing and downright catastrophic. Snap decisions, in effect, were the realm of the local military commander. Admiral Krassenberg was technically the ranking officer in the system, but he and his XO were offered a conference, or whatever they told their wives. The old Marine grimaced and turned back to his aides. How many ships do we have in system? Sir, possibly as many as 30 if certain, the aide began before, like so much wheatgrass in front of a bonfire, watered accommodatingly, before the words had even fully formed in Wu's mouth. How many ships are here now? Wu growled. 7, the aide stuttered. 4 garrison frigates, 2 transport boats, and a cargo hauler. Plus the local police boats, the other aide chirped, in what he immediately realized was a lapse in judgment. Wu turned his still gaze towards the second aide and grimaced, as the man accommodatingly melted in front of him. In that moment, Wu forgot about the existential threat of an unknown alien armada to revel in his pure and uncompromising hatred of the men in front of him. Here he was, about to square off against God knows what, and all he had at his back were pussies who were too scared of him to control their own bowels. He fought off the urge to headbutt the nearest of his aides, and then fought off a second urge to punch the corridor wall, before gritting his teeth and storming into the ops center. "Commander on deck!" bellowed the technician nearest the door when Wu stormed in. Wu grimaced internally as everyone in the room stopped what they were doing and shot to their feet. He hated their shit. Work, damn you. Don't drop everything because I walked into the fucking room. Do you think the enemy gives a shit that I've... He controlled himself. "As you were," he said, as the room returned to a flurry of activity. "How many bogies are there and how far out are they?" "Somewhere north of 100, sir," came the reply, as Wu lopped over to the responding sailor. "A few of them are pretty big too. No families yet." "Fuck," Wu grimaced. "How are the station defenses? How long until the main battery is online?" Sir?" came a quiet voice from behind him. Wu turned to an aide who was turning an interesting and indecisive shade of either white or green. "The main capacitors for the battery are planet-side for maintenance." "Oh, well, isn't that abso-fucking-lutely brilliant?" Wu growled. "How long until we can have the backups installed?" That the aide began to add a slight hue of purple to his repertoire suggested that the answer was going to be less than favourable. The backups aren't here yet, sir." "Bullshit, Marine, I signed off on that last supply list myself. They should have been on the last freighter in." "Admiral Krassenberg bumped them, sir." Wu was beginning to imagine what the aide might look like without a head. With a razor-sharp whisper, pushed with gritted teeth, he asked, 4? The aide's eyes began to dart wildly around the room from exit to exit as the old Marine towered over him. Wu was a big man by anyone's standards. Nearly 6'7", his hard jaw and tight haircut reminded the aide of a particularly angry leopard. He wondered briefly if not answering at all was an option, before quietly saying, He needed champagne for his, birthday party." For a significant fraction of the next second, Wu seriously considered throwing the aide out of an airlock. For most of the next 3, he considered ordering the aide to go outside and throw rocks at the aliens. The following 7 were mostly spent considering whether he could use the station's main battery to shell the resort Admiral Krassenberg was lounging at, before remembering that Admiral Krassenberg had left him a main battery that couldn't shell anything. Instead, he punched a wall. "This goddamn fuck-brain peacetime pile of fuck monkeys," he bellowed. "Why the fuck do any of these shit-gargling ass-nose—" "Sir," a voice yelled from the other side of the room, cutting off what was likely to be at least a further 10 minutes of creative swearing. "What?" Wu walked back. "The alien fleet is hailing us." Wu took a deep breath and collected himself. He was angry, but he was a professional. He'd see if he couldn't talk a big enough game to get them all out of this. Besides, he thought, maybe they know as little about what we're capable of as we know about them. He suppressed a mirthful grimace at his own wishful thinking. "Very well," said Wu. "On screen." The creature that filled the Ops Center's main monitor was like nothing we had ever seen. Much of the work in the room slowed to a crawl as sailors and marines turned to look at the creature. Humans were new to the galactic scene, granted, but there was something spectacularly novel about the alien before them. A carapace of shimmering blue and black, with subtle undertones of purple and gold, stood half covered by a uniform studded with glittering medals of rank and office. Deep, piercing golden eyes protruded from a head that betrayed a deep sense of dignity across its alien physiometry. It was, they all later agreed, easily the most beautiful bug any of them had ever seen. Wu drew himself up to his full height, straightened his uniform, and intoned in his most authoritative and formal voice, "This is General Arthur Wu, 14th Fleet Marines. You are trespassing in the space of the Human Union as agreed by treaty with the Galactic League. State your intentions, or we will treat you as hostile and respond accordingly." The alien regarded Wu for a long moment, as if measuring the worth of the being in front of it. Slowly, but with an almost imperceptible grace, it maneuvered its manipulators, and spoke. "This is Admiral Jeff, Unified Commander of the Cryothori Hegemony 1st Volunteer Expeditionary Fleet and the Tabori Mixed Fleet," the bug alien said. "And I and those under my command hereby formally request sanctuary and military alliance with the Mans."